Welcome and thank you for joining us. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be revisiting a guest we've had on the show talking about his book, Brighton Baby, which is an extremely large but very detailed book that's very fascinating to read to find out how you can have healthy super children, so to speak. And today we're going to be talking about the prevention of infection and how we can reduce inflammation. We're going to find out why that's important and what things we need to do to be able to achieve that. I'd like to welcome our guest today, author of The Brighton Baby, Dr. Roy Dittman. Dr. Dittman, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Good afternoon, Daniel.
Now, tell us about inflammation and infection and how that actually affects future generations.
Yes, this is a very important subject, in my opinion, in the perinatal period, the period preconception, during pregnancy, and, of course, especially in the first 3 years of life. I think this is a highly misunderstood area. And a lot of what we're diagnosing as serious illnesses, like autism spectrum disorders and ADD and so forth, is really more accurately related to infection, chronic infection, acute infections, inflammation, and oftentimes exacerbated by the overprescription of drugs. It's something that is really a great passion of mine to help parents to discern what to do during this time period and what is safe to do. And oftentimes, I like to use the example of the 1918 flu epidemic and also the polio epidemic as perfect examples of what really happened at the time and how we overreacted. And that was, the 1918 flu epidemic, it's estimated that as much as, 100 million people died. Some people say 50 million, some say 40 million. The truth is we don't really know. So many people died that it was just beyond comprehension. I mean, every town in America, for instance, had lined up coffins at every corner. I mean, it was just horrific. And if we look at it at that time, which is about 100 years ago now, doctors prescribed very high dosages of aspirin, and that was their SOPs, their standard operating procedures were to mandate that they give aspirin, and it was quite effective at lowering temperature, fevers. So it made sense to them. But today, of course, we know that giving children aspirin causes Ray's syndrome. It also causes intestinal bleeding. It causes a whole cascade of inflammation in the body because it allows the infection, the viral, bacterial, whatever agents are causing the infection to go directly into the bloodstream and into the brain, which can cause massive, rapid death actually within hours. In those days, as much as 35 to 50 grams of aspirin was prescribed. It wasn't the typical dose, but if you even look at even at a low dosage, it was extremely high by our standards, 2 to 3 times as high as would even be allowed. And this was pretty standard, and they would even give it to children. And you also look at the same statistics where homeopathic doctors, naturopathic doctors were not prescribing aspirin, and they were warning people not to take aspirin. And if you look at the politics around the Rockefeller family funding the Flexner Report and very aggressively promoting the prescription of drugs, not just for emergency or urgent care, but for daily care. This happened this is like 1913, 1918, this time period. They saw there was a lot of money to be made from drugs, and it's something they could totally control. And they were heavily invested in Bayer pharmaceuticals in Germany at the time. And Bayer's patent had just run out. So what happened at that time was that the American pharmaceutical companies started, which were not very big at that time. Mm-hmm. They said, well, this is a great economic opportunity for us. Let's be Bayer to it, and we'll prescribe it, and we can make it cheaper and more available. And so suddenly there was just a flood of advertisements and promotion of aspirin. And what medical anthropologists have discovered, Daniel, is fascinating. This research started with some studies in 2005, and since has been validated and corroborated by independent universities, medical schools. And today, it's a huge embarrassment. You don't hear this on the 6 o'clock news, even though this is scientifically validated and corroborated. The reason why is it's a huge embarrassment to the pharmaceutical companies, because the reason why is that was the justification for the scare tactics that these pharmaceutical companies were using at that time to force people and corral people into taking vaccinations later on, and also to taking more drugs, and not following the natural approach. Now, if you look at the deaths that were occurring with patients who were seeing naturopathic physicians, homeopathic physicians at that time, it was less than 2%. So you can clearly see that the ones who were taking aspirin were the ones who died. Now, the claim today, even by the CDC itself, is that a virus caused, this horrific, avian flu struck our country and the world and caused all these horrible, diseases. Nothing comparable had happened in human history except for the plague. Well, what we find the facts are is nothing close to that, like what I just described. And in fact, just the opposite. Now, let's take another example, and that is polio. If you look at the statistics for polio, and then you look at the same graph for the amount of DDT that was being dispersed into our food chain, on crops, in the 50s, children were sprayed directly. You can see these in the old school photos. I remember seeing photographs of these, and they would take these canisters and spray DDT onto children directly, right on top of them. Can you imagine this? This is horrific. And at the time,
we're going after Hitler for the kind of nonsense he pulled in World War II.
Exactly.
And we're spraying our own kids with poison. I wonder what maniac came up with that idea.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's the irony of it. If the terrorists came over and killed one child, we'd be nuking them, in 2 seconds. But you can kill off millions of people, and everyone looks the other way. It depends who they are.
Right.
But you can see here that the graph, what's fascinating, Daniel, you can see this is the graph of how much dosage we were spraying directly on our children and giving to our children, correlated with the epidemic of polio. So
wow.
You can see it. It's almost identical. It's scarily identical. And as soon as we stopped doing that, the polio epidemic went away. And so what a lot of, here's where they get us. Here's where they really get us. First they get us with this fear, because do you remember when you were a kid seeing those horrible pictures of these kids in the iron lung and they can't even move their head? Remember those pictures?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember as a kid just thinking, oh my God, I don't ever want to be like that. Let me take the shot, whatever it is, right? And but the other tactics that they use is what I call the tactics of scientism. It's very confusing, intimidating. And, the average person says, oh, my God, my doctor went to Stanford and he went to Harvard and he or she is really, really smart and, and they condescend to you like, who are you? You're stupid. You don't know anything.
Right.
And so people are very intimidated. They get like hypnotized, and they just say, oh, my God, I just have to vaccinate my child. Oh, my God. But what they do is they point to a virus and they say, look at the study. And as soon as you say, a study was done, people are hypnotized. It's like,
right.
Oh, a study was done. But I always say, let me look closer at the study. And everyone should do that. Studies aren't hard to understand. It's just graphs. It's like an X coordinate and a Y coordinate, and then you've got numbers on one, and then you have time, and then amount on the other. It's pretty simple as it gets, right? It's like tic-tac-toe. And it doesn't take much to figure out a graph. What's the problem is the way they write it. It's so friggin' ridiculous, the terminology and so forth. Can't even understand what they're saying half the time. But as Einstein says, if you really understand the subject, you should be able to explain it to a child. And I couldn't agree more. So I tell people, look, in ordinary language, what's happening there is they're pointing to a virus, which is there. They're saying, look at the virus. It's in high concentrations in these children. And I said, well, that didn't happen in the past. I mean, we've lived without aspirin up until this time, and we introduced it about 100 years ago. And we've changed the terrain at that time, so to speak. So what we did is we allowed things which were pretty benign, which our intestinal tract was in our immune system, our cellular immunity would adapt to over time. And we have an amazing immune system that's like a separate brain. And instead, we opened up the gates of hell by causing intestinal bleeding and allowing these infections to go directly into a child's bloodstream. Even worse yet, we're injecting these pathogens directly into a child's bloodstream, even before 1 year old. Today, they recommend 36 vaccinations before a child's 1. I think that's insane. There's no evidence that children even need these things. Most of them have long been gone. Do I need something for scarlet fever? What about tetanus? That seems reasonable, right? Well, you don't really need one until it happens.
Well, here's the big one.
On rusty nails?
Yeah, what I was going to say was, we'll get back to that one in a second too, is that you see it every year, at least twice a year, come here for your flu vaccination. And I'm thinking, who was the guy that thought this up? I never go for any of those. I can't remember the last time I had a needle in my arm, unless I was donating blood. But the fact is, you get sick, you get a little bit of the flu, it comes and it goes. Why are we vaccinating for the flu? Well, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do, because see, if you look closer at those studies, there's really nothing. They have nothing to stand on, actually.
Right.
I think we should be doing just the opposite of what our ancestors have learned over millions of years, and that is we want to consume fermented foods and eat things that are closer to how nature made them, and stop eating processed foods. We know today what reduces infection in the body and inflammation. There's lots of amazing knowledge around herbs and homeopathic medicines that are gentle for children, improving the tissue integrity in your organs and glands, balancing out your hormones, exercising correctly, getting enough sunlight. You see that when we do these things, and there's a lot more to this. I'm being very simplistic because we don't have time to go into all the details that we know today clinically. But I would say my colleagues concur with this opinion, who are naturopathic doctors, holistic MDs, and so forth. We see this every day. We see these things working quite well. I haven't vaccinated any of my children. And they always get over everything they have, and they've had everything from chicken pox, measles, mumps, everything. They get all the childhood diseases intentionally. I take them to a Chuck E. Cheese intentionally, only for this purpose, because I say, go play with those kids over there, see with the snot hanging out, go play with those kids. And I purposely have them get infected, and then I put them in a hygiene bath of like iodine and salt. It's in the old pediatric text. And you know what? They never have any of these things more than 2 days. Now, I don't know about you, but when I used to get mumps or measles, chicken pox, any of these things, I was down for 2 to 3 weeks. And but because their immune systems haven't been suppressed by vaccinations, and excessive use of antibiotics and aspirin and NSAIDs and, the whole gamut of things we use to assault kids' immune systems, well, their immune systems actually work quite well. So I tell people, look, try this out. And, they always come back to me and they say, I can't believe it. This is so simple and costs nothing, and it works every time. I can't imagine not having lived without this before. And I tell every parent that I meet, to read your book, Brighton Baby, and to learn how to do these things with their children, because, before I was just in a panic when my child would get sick or something. I said, exactly. And I said, look, and they have, oftentimes the first child, they went the conventional route, and then the second child, they go the Brighton Baby route, and they just said, I'm so ashamed of myself. I didn't know this. I said, don't feel guilty. I've been there. We've all been there. You can't know everything. She said, but there's such a big difference between the first child and the second. I said, yeah. She said, that's just the way it is. But, the best thing to do is share this with your friends and your family so that they don't have to learn the hard way. And so as you know, Daniel, you're trying to spread this.
No, it's okay. There was something I was going to ask, in pertaining to viruses and how you were exposing your children to these things and how they would just heal naturally without having to have any inoculations or anything. But I was thinking, as we go back to the past, go back into history, when the Europeans began to come over to America in hordes, so to speak, that the largest, from my understanding, cause of death for the Native Americans, was smallpox. And that being said, here was, indigenous tribes that were living off the land purely and simply. Why that happened to them?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you for asking that. Because here's a good example of group immunity. And if you look at the actual statistics for vaccinations, you'll see they're only showing you the very, very far right, minute 1% corner when they introduce the vaccine, and then they blow that up and they credit the vaccine with eliminating the epidemic. And I put these graphs in the book, in my book Brighton Baby. And if you look at the real graph, the whole graph, when the epidemic started, you see that group immunity had long set in, and 95% to 99% of the epidemic was already gone. And so group immunity is what happens when our immune systems learn and adapt to a particular kind of immunological challenge. And the case with the American Indians, they had not built up group immunity because this was a whole new set of pathogens that Europeans had been adapted to, but that the Native Americans were not. And so the way you would do that, say in naturopathic medicine, what we know today, is you would gradually give them very minute doses of it and have them gradually adjust to that, and they would practice good hygiene, and you'd give them fermented foods, and you'd give them very strong probiotics so their immune systems can learn and adapt better. You give them, seawater. By the way, in my tribe, I'm part Chumash Indian, that's native California Indian. We use seawater, like within the original ketone marine plasma, as a therapeutic medicine. And indeed, also the Polynesians used it as well. And it's one of these simple things that sometimes it's so simple it kind of people overlook it. But having been in clinical use longer than aspirin, actually, in Europe, you can see there's a lot of empirical, scientific, and clinical data, especially in France and Spain, Switzerland, Holland, England, and Germany, around using this as a therapy. And it's one of the first things I do. I give my kids the original ketone marine plasma when they're sick.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it depends how old they are. If they're under 3, you want to give them the isotonic, or the quintessential. The one sold to the public is called quintessential 0.9. That's referring to the concentration. So it's a perfect isotonic solution, identical to human blood. And this one's really good for balance and relaxing, and for children under the age of 3, it's amazing, actually. And rather than causing there to be perforations in their intestines like aspirin does and NSAIDs do, or like acetaminophen does, it really suppresses the liver function. It can be very dangerous for infants. This actually does the opposite. This helps your cellular immunity in the child's intestinal tract, and acts as a prebiotic to the probiotic. So it is the best food, in other words, for the positive, life-supporting probiotics in your gut. And for that reason, it's very powerful. I've seen children, infants, go into an autism coma, where the parents were really panicked, and they call me, or they go to their house, or whatever, and I say, what happened? And usually what happens is they've done the trifecta of autism no-nos, and that is, and this is standard SOPs for doctors, believe it or not. But each one of these is. The trifecta for causing autism is you give an infant within a 2 to 3 month period vaccinations, multiple vaccinations, and they get like a reaction, and they give the doctor gives them something to bring down the fever, just like in the 1918 flu, aspirin, NSAIDs or acetaminophen. Then they give them antibiotics to bring down the infection, because they're having, their lungs might fill up with mucus, or they're getting more mucus, because they're getting almost all children to be born with some kind of fungal yeast overgrowth. And then, the kid oftentimes will go into a coma or be fully autistic after that, or have seizures. So what I found helps to bring them out of that is the isotonic solution, 2 vials of that. Usually you can feed it with a dropper or in a bottle, with it's a very high strain probiotics, super strain probiotics. They're as much as 1 trillion at a time, and that usually brings them out of coma, and I've seen it do wonders. The good thing about infancy is the children are so responsive. And likewise, and on the other hand, though, we often wrongly assume that because we're okay and we have heavy metals and we've been exposed to these chemicals and toxins and so forth, that it's okay for our children. But doctors and people often forget that the embryological brain can be 100 or 1,000 times more susceptible to the damage from the same things that we ordinarily live with. And that's because the nervous system and the brain is in its earliest stages of forming, and the damage is exponentially greater during that period.
And here's another thing, too. We had a former president of Good Earth Baby Foods on our program. And that was just a fascinating story to read, how back in the 1980s, him and his brother decided to launch a whole natural baby food product for babies. And so they talked about the history of the baby food industry, and it was pretty heartening to hear some of the things that they were talking about. What goes into baby food? It's basically food waste and chemicals. And they were just, it was astounding to learn that here we're giving this to our babies at one of the most critical times in their lives, when their immune systems are the most fragile as they're developing, and that this was being allowed, and not even, and everybody gets stuck on this, it's not FDA approved. And I remember one time I was talking with someone about a particular thing that I thought might help them. And she says, well, I was looking at the information that you gave me, and the one thing that bothers me is it's not FDA approved. okay? And it cracked me up because I knew what she was saying is I'm really not interested, so I'm going to find a reason to not be interested. That should make rational sense. And I said, let me ask you this question. Do you know what the role of the FDA is? And then she started tongue twisting and tying, and that just blew her out of the water. And I said, do you know what it means to have FDA approval? And she didn't have the answer to that either. So much for that argument for not wanting to get involved. But I said specifically, if my understanding is correct, okay, that if you produce, let's say, a drug, and it's for a specific purpose, which is, to get rid of headaches, it has to go through testing to be sure consistently that's what this drug does. So when you put it out on the market, take this pill for this headache, the FDA says, yes, we approve that. That's what this does. Is that the right way to look at it?
Yeah, I would say so too. And
the reason I'm just bringing this up because a lot of times people just pin like all this integrity on the FDA, and if they really looked into the nature of that, they would go, "Are we out of our minds?"
Well, yeah,
which goes back to studies and science and everything else that we hypnotize ourselves with. Anyway.
Well, I agree with you, Daniel. It's like the Wizard of Oz. You pull back the curtain and see what's really there. And I have.
The dog is more real than the wizard.
Exactly. Well, yeah, actually, I've been a long-time health freedom activist, and so has Allison as well. We met that way, actually. She was working on the Keep Organic campaign, and we were both working with Citizens for Health, and we were lobbying at both the state legislative level and the national legislation. And actually, I was heading up things here in California, and she was in Virginia. And we did a lot of negotiations with FDA and FCC, and worked with. I can tell you that people at the highest level in our administration that you can imagine. They used to work for us at that time, and we negotiated with U.S. senators and so forth. We got 3 million letters to Congress, and we got DSHEA passed, the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act. And we've also started and ran 3 biopharmaceutical companies, by the way. And so I know both sides of the fence very well. I love science, but I don't like scientism, which is based upon, kind of a belief system, kind of an inner cult of what they say is right and what they're paid to say in a study. It's actually a form of corruption, in fact. And I've worked at many and funded research and directed research at many major universities in the United States as well. And I can say with experience that what you're saying is just the tip of the iceberg. You're really quite gentle about it.
I allow my expert guests who come on the program to really throw the iceberg at the audience. So, when you hear the credentials of someone like you, they realize this is real credible stuff. And if it, at least it's a stepping direction for you to look into this more into yourself instead of allowing yourself to continually be hypnotized into believing sometimes a direction that may not be so good for you. So.
Well, yeah, right. And I mean, in my experience, the FDA is really a way of controlling competition for drugs. If you look at the portfolios of judges and senators, Congress members, a lot of powerful people, and Wall Street and so forth, they're all heavily vested in pharmaceutical stocks, and they have huge conflicts of interest, for one thing. And it's like you said, they're looking at only one thing, and that is, if you're making a claim, you have to prove that it does this. The side effects aren't that important, actually, as long as you report them, is the truth. They just want you to report what are called adverse events. If you report those adverse events, then you're in compliance, basically. And so they have their own system, and it's basically, the FDA is a watchdog for big pharma, really. It's kind of a protection racket. And if you really want to be quite frank about it, they don't want to allow anything that would compete with their pharmaceutical drug profits. That's really what they're doing. Mm-hmm. And so the public's very united. It's like, well, this is very safe, and this is safe for the public because they think the FDA is there is for safety to protect you, but it's not. It's to protect them from any losses on the stock market. Mm-hmm. So once you get in there, and I'm not being cynical. I'm trying to be authentic, because the reason why it's important to be frank about these things is we will never solve the autism epidemic until we see its correlation to international bankster, what they're doing, how finance and economics are run in our country, how the military is controlled through big banks as well, how politics and the media is complicit in undermining our democratic republic, and manipulating and interfering with our elections, which are really auctions these days. And we will never get over these core issues of birth defects and autism until we recognize what is actually causing it. And if people are still in denial and, excuse me for saying, but downright delusional about what's causing these problems, because then it will never get solved. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, there are organizations that are making a lot of money and launching entire industries to live off of the tragedy of these children instead of trying to prevent it. And that's just unconscionable. I can't think of a more heinous crime our government has done, is to be complicit in destroying future generations than the autism epidemic. Mm-hmm. And it is not a mystery. We don't need to wait 30 years for more genetic studies. Right. When I hear stuff like that, it makes me nauseous.
Well, and I was going to say, here was an interesting thing, too. As I know, you well know from the last time you were on the program, my wife is dealing with a son that sort of went into the shadows, but he seems to be coming out of it, which is encouraging, of what looked like the autistic spectrum. So she goes to a doctor, and so this guy with a lot of confidence says, oh, I've seen this, you're going to be just fine, blah, 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 which is a nice thing to hear. And then he prescribes him Abilify. And that was his answer to the problem. And my wife sat there and she says simply, you're not going to do any tests. This is the only course of action. And it's unfortunate, but that's what a lot of them, it sounds like they're doing out there, is putting them on these very powerful prescriptions. Now, removing all that aside, I'm not one to bash the pharmaceutical industries or doctors who are actually doing what they believe is the right thing to do, but back to what our conversation is about, which is how to alleviate chronic infection and inflammation. Isn't that kind of what causes autism in the first place, is inflammation and infection?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that everyone agrees about, so to speak, is that there is a correlation between maternal infection and autism spectrum disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar disorders. Patterson's work at USC, who I agree with on this issue, not on other issues like vaccinations, has written a pretty good book about that, actually. And but I would go further and say it correlates to both paternal and maternal infections. And that's why I put so much emphasis on Brighton Baby, a revolutionary organic approach to having an extraordinary child. My book on the subject, I devote a couple chapters to how to get rid of chronic infections in the body, and therefore also inflammation. And it's been one of the core things that I've been practicing for about 30 years. And one of the things I focus on is the elimination or reduction of chronic gum, dental, throat, adenoid, sinusoid, eustachian tube or ear infections, and other infections in the body. And there's very practical methods, therapies, and products and foods that I recommend in Brighton Baby for parents to follow And I recommend most of these things to be done during the preconception period, when you can eliminate like such things as heavy metals without causing great damage to your baby. Because if you try to do these things during the prenatal period, you're using your baby as a toxic dump site, and that can be very dangerous. So that's why I really focused the 1,000 pages in Brighton Baby Preconception and Conception, Volume 1, is about really doing the heavy-duty lifting, so to speak, of eliminating these toxins before you conceive. And indeed, these days I test people's hair, blood, urine, and you see very clearly that, or not, that whether they should have a baby. Most of the time I tell people, look, I said, what you want to ask the question about if you can't get pregnant is what is your body trying to tell you? Well, here we see it, and I'll say, look, you've got heavy metals. You would want to have a child.
So your body's really saying, forget about it. It ain't happening right now.
Exactly.
It's not a fertility issue, in other words.
Exactly. And oftentimes they force the issue, then they have a child, and tragically the child is severely damaged. And so I tell people, these days we have generations of accumulated toxins. So, and mistakenly, I have lots of friends who, they're wonderful people. They're vegetarians or they're vegans. They mean well. They're good people, and they live in Santa Monica or in, Orange County or San Diego or up in the Bay Area, all over the country and the world. And they think, well, I eat perfectly raw, organic food, and it's just the highest quality. It's grass-fed, whatever. And I said, well, look, that's all great, but you don't realize that we've been accumulating these heavy metals and pesticides now for many generations, and food isn't enough to get these things out. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, if you talk to most people on the street, probably 95% or 99% would say, yeah, I eat perfectly. I'm ready to have a healthy baby. I'm totally healthy. So is my wife, and we're ready to go. And we exercise. We do all this stuff. And that's completely wrong. It's completely 100% wrong. Now, there are some people who are healthy, luckily, because maybe their parents were, not exposed to a lot of heavy metals, but that's very rare these days. Almost everyone has. I'm in this industry, and it's my job to know all this stuff, and so are you, Daniel. I mean, don't you hear something new that you never knew, like almost every week?
Oh, yes, for years. And what's funny is it's once you have the knowledge, you begin to see, and I don't mean disrespect, but how stupid people become when they start spouting off, well, I heard this on television. It's always something like that, or I believe it's this. And, and you can ask the simplest questions, and it just tangles these people up. Well, where did you hear that from? How credible is that source? And, being in journalism or in broadcasting, that's the responsibility, and sometimes I don't feel so great about the industry myself when I see the kind of information and how it's presented. In fact, I tell people, if you really listen to the news, you'll realize how ambiguous it is. They don't really say anything. They really don't. Unless there is a house on fire. That's a fact we can point, there it is. But everything else, it's so general in what they say that you draw your own conclusions about what you think they said, and that's what becomes the truth. And that absolves them from any wrongdoing in case it turns out to be wrong in the first place, And never more should an area, have, at least more conciseness in an area such as what you're talking about in healthcare, and eating healthy, and you hear what they're spouting out there and what the truth is, and people really need to really take more responsibility into finding out, okay, Brighton Baby seems like a pretty good book to go and start with, and it's a fascinating read, and you take the next step. It isn't just as simple as going out and jogging 2 or 3 miles a day and eating, all organic grass-fed food. I guess there's more to it than that. Now, here's one. Yeah. We actually did a whole program on this, and you talk about this in your book, and that is oil pulling. And this one really fascinated me, and it was interesting to see that you had that as well. talk about what oil pulling is.
Well, oil pulling came from the Ayurvedic doctors in India. It's an ancient practice to help pull out bacterial and other kinds of infections from the gums and teeth. It's funny because we look at places like Dubai and the United Arab Emirates. I've been over there, and I was invited to be a co-CEO of Healthcare Village at one time by people over there, and really nice people. But if you look at just like 30-something years ago, the number one cause of death in the UAE was the tooth infections that went to their brain and just killed them.
Wow. And
they had such poor dental health. So to most of the world, as we know it, these things are kind of new concepts. Dental health, what's that?
Mm-hmm.
And, likewise, even in our culture, when I've spoken at conferences of, OBGYN, I've said the fact that the number 1 to 2 cause of miscarriages is gum infection. They object and say, wait a second now, I've never heard that. And I said, well, you obviously aren't talking to the dentist. I've just come from 2 dental conferences, and every dentist, every dental hygienist knows this fact. So, and then, let me see the references. Well, we would know that. We're OBGYN. But I said, well, obviously not. And I said, look, I don't blame you guys. You guys don't communicate enough with the other disciplines. Go talk to these guys. Call them up and have a little conversation, and you'll learn the facts about this. And they're shocked to see that this is correct. There was only one doctor in the audience who knew that this was a fact, actually. Embarrassing. And so these are blind spots I try to tell the public about, because these days you're better off telling your doctor and questioning them and saying, do you know about this, or do you know about that, or what kind of results do you get? How many of your children are cesarean born? How many children that are born in your system have colic, or how many of the women have morning sickness? See, on my program, I've been doing this for 30 years. Women never have these problems. I mean, yes, there's emergency C-sections, which are, that's quite different. For women who come already pregnant, you can't do the same things by the time they're pregnant as you can to prepare them preconception. But other than that, they don't ever get morning sickness, for instance. And the reason why is that the liver is not congested, and therefore they don't have morning sickness. It's a protective mechanism, the morning sickness, to save the baby's brain from the toxins in the mother's liver. So it's a good thing, actually. So, but it's even better to decongest the liver and get these toxins out before conception. I go over that.
Mm-hmm.
But I wanted to also get back to your question as well and cover some of these really, really important questions that you're asking. To repeat what you were saying before, because
what I was asking about was oil pulling.
The oil pulling, yeah.
Yeah.
And so the oil pulling is a very practical, easy way to help reduce infection in the mouth. And it's also safe to do during pregnancy. So I tried to show methods like this in Brighton Baby that are very cheap, very affordable, for instance, and user-friendly. It's easy to do, and anybody can do it. And then, but bear in mind that there's a lot of clinical, technological, and scientific things that I don't put in there, that I only teach to doctors and health professionals around the world. And indeed, we're starting teaching hospitals. We have one already that we're starting with soon, where we're training doctors to be perinatal specialists and doing residency, where they can do hands-on learning with some of the world's greatest medical scientists, OBGYNs,
mm-hmm.
and so forth. And a lot of what I focus on is these chronic infections, because when you have infection in the body, it causes a whole cascade of inflammation. And, for instance, if we look at someone's blood and we see that they have low albumin and high globulin levels, that's a sign of chronic infection. because these are the two major blood proteins in our blood. And the way the body regulates this is it can only have so many proteins in there. And so if there's infection, the globulins will go much higher and the albumin will automatically come down. Now, albumin's produced in the liver. So that's another reason to decongest liver and make the liver strong and healthy. Now, one of the things I've noticed is that when mothers and fathers and their babies have really high levels of albumin, they tend to have also higher levels of other critical growth factors like IGF-1 and IGF-2 mannose-6-phosphate, which are critical to the baby's brain development. And I also find that these critical antioxidant types of molecules like albumin and glutathione, metallothionein, manganese superoxide dismutase that are all produced in the liver are just amazing molecules that help to protect your baby's brain from inflammation. So if it does get a vaccination, if it does get an assault from antibiotic, or does it get an assault from a drug, for instance, the mother is on or the father was on, preconception, that's a whole different matter, but that the baby has a protective mechanism from that. And I like to give the baby that kind of protection. And, of course, this gives the mother a much easier pregnancy. They just glide through their pregnancy, and they can really enjoy being pregnant. Who can enjoy being pregnant when you're feeling nauseous all day for 5 months and vomiting every day? It's no fun.
No.
And so we really focus on these details. And like I said, a lot of this is something we do in the clinic with really well-trained OBGYNs and holistic pediatricians and really well-trained holistic dental dentists and hygienists and naturopathic doctors. And we like to look at the blind spots. So a lot of what you see in Brighton Baby are the blind spots. It's a very unusual book because I went to all these bookstores, and I love to read. I'm a bookaholic. If there's anything, I can be accused of. It's been that way my whole life. But I love to read. In my spare time, I go to used bookstores and other bookstores, unusual bookstores, and I look at new books out and old books, and I go to these the pregnancy section, and I look at all the books and I read them, and I say, well, I don't want to give somebody something they already know. I want to give something that they don't know. Mm-hmm. I want to make a difference in their lives. I want to help them to have the ultimate, pregnancy for the women to say to me, look, I look better after my pregnancy. How is that? I want them to experience the miracle of having just an amazing baby. And that's the real joy of life. And there's nothing better than that. So I said, how can I write a book that really gives the meat, and I want to take all the fluff out of it. I edited it 7 times. That I want to take all fluff out of it, any kind of thing that's not meaningful, that rambles on, that's not interesting. And indeed, even though it's 1,000 pages, people say, I really loved reading it. It was so enjoyable. I just got hooked, and I read it in just a few days. I said, you read a 1,000-page book in a few days? That's amazing. But, it does happen. So I think that back to this issue, though, around infection, a lot of what we're causing autism, I would agree with some of the doctors who out there are asserting that it is more like encephalitis, encephalopathy, and because of chronic infection. However, like the flu epidemic and like the polio epidemic, just because you point to that virus over there as the culprit, doesn't mean that is the culprit. That's an opportunistic infection, which arises when we have suppressed a child's immune system, first of all. Mm-hmm. We've assaulted it with inflammation. When we have caused generational problems where we've deleted or suppressed important genes and enzymes and cofactors, and we've ruined their gut, with GMOs and glyphosate and heavy metals, and we've assaulted their brains so that their endocrine system doesn't work properly. And we've ruined their gut bacteria and their gut lining. See, these things are so critical, because if we just say one thing, like, let's get heavy metals out, well, that's no longer enough. You know what I mean, Daniel? We have to look at the whole picture these days. And the best doctors I find, the real brilliant doctors, think synergistically or integrally, and they can look at all the different components of why a child has a particular condition. And indeed, I find that if you look at it, it's like, well, why would a baby have encephalitis? I ask doctors, like, since when do babies, are they born with encephalitis, Mm-hmm. And this is a modern phenomenon. It's just like, well, look what we've introduced into their environment since in the last 100 years. Processed foods, massive amounts of sugar, GMOs, aspartame, MSG, drug use, prescription and illegal drugs. We have pesticides. We have plasticizers and estrogenic mimicking chemicals that are making children being born androgynous with, suppressed brain functions and so forth, and hormonal functions. And we have all kinds of things that are adding up to a suppressed human functioning. And because we know that, if we look at the bad news, I tell people, look, I know this is not a pleasant conversation about what we're doing to our children. If you can bear with me, let's get through this phase of it. Because unless you know the blind spots, unless you know what's wrong with the system, what's happening to our children, we're not going to really cognize or fully know what to do about how to fix it. And the good news is we do know how to fix it today. And I think that most of my doctor friends now concur. And at Autism One conference, I saw so many mothers and fathers coming up to the booths and saying, and my lecture, and they have completely healed their children. Now, some haven't, but a lot are. I mean, you're talking about really severely brain damaged autistic children. And these moms have been so dedicated, and fathers, bless their hearts, and they're like saints. They've done an extraordinary job, and they've healed their children. It brought tears to my eyes, I can't tell you how many times, to just see the joy in these children and their parents. And it's like seeing a miracle, because I never knew. I mean, when this first happened, my child was also born with autism spectrum disorder 21 years ago. And that's why I really focused on this area, because I realized I had a huge blind spot called heavy metal. And luckily, I intervened quickly, and I was able to help him a lot, where he had a lot of his symptoms and were early on resolved. But bless their hearts, a lot of parents just don't know, and they believe in their doctors, and they do believe in the system, and they do believe that, in Santa Claus. Which I tell them, I said, look, for grown men to believe in Santa Claus ain't normal. You gotta read this, my friend. But I think we have to be very careful how we present it to them. I tell fathers and mothers, please share this with other parents, please, but don't be judgmental, don't be too critical. Just say in a loving thing, please read this, because it will make a big difference, in your future. Not just my book. This is not really about me. I want people not to think like me, but just to think. That's all I'm requesting.
And that's the importance of why we produce the show, is that we can start hopefully pointing people in a direction that they'll find will be fascinating for them to explore, regardless of what it is. That's why we like to call it Beyond 50. It's going past halfway thinking. Looking at a holistic way to approach things, and to pursue them and ask better questions. That's really, knowledge is great when it's applied, but it's even better when you apply better questions, which you should always be asking, and certainly Brighton Baby will help people to do that. Dr. Dittman, if you can, for our listeners, as we've got about 1 to 2 minutes left here, give people an idea where they can find you on the Internet website.
Sure, yes. You can go to brightonbaby.com. or you can also go to Brighton Baby on Facebook. You can reach me at royditzman@gmail.com, or you can always call me at 949-302-9007. That's 949-302-9007. And I'm always glad to talk to parents and assist them in having healthy, happy families. And I just want to thank you for inviting me on the show. And please, if you can if you're planning on having a baby, or you're a grandparent, or your aunt or uncle, please share this with your family. Brighton Baby, with my name, Roy Ditzman, spelled with 2 T's and 2 N's, can be found on Balboa Press site as well. And you just Google my name, Roy Ditzman, OMD, on the internet. You'll see all different interviews and articles I've written in my career.
All right.
And thank you very much, Daniel, for having me on the show. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, you betcha. It's a pleasure to have someone like you giving information, as you were stating earlier. These are blind spots, and we certainly need to be sure that people can start seeing a little bit better than they have. We want to thank you again for joining us. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Bye-bye.
We also encourage you, the listeners out there, to visit us at beyond50radio.com. We're going to have a hot link there for you so you can find out more about Brighton Baby. Fascinating book. We want to thank you for tuning in. You've been listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. Remember, live your day past halfway.